Okay, in the previous example, we looked at this formula here only using pictures. So for 3 molecules of H2, give you 1 molecule of N2 plus 1 molecule of N2 to form 2 molecules of NH3. Now we're going to look at a scenario where we have grams of a substance. So given 3 grams of H2 and 10 grams of nitrogen, how much ammonia can I make? And then what's my limiting reactant? What's my excess reactant? Now one might say, well, I have less hydrogen, so this must be my limiting reactant. However, remember that 1 molecule of H2 weighs a lot less than a molecule of N2, and so from the periodic table, we know that this is a much heavier and bigger molecule, and so we have to determine how many moles of each thing we're going to make first. In addition, these react in a 3-to-1 ratio, so I can't just determine the moles of each thing and compare the two things and say, well, I have less of one thing, because they react in a specific ratio. And so for only one of these, you need 3 of these to react. And so therefore, the strategy is going to be, I'm going to take my moles of H2 and figure out how many moles of NH3 can I make. Do the same thing. I'm going to take my grams of nitrogen, determine how many moles of NH3 can I make, and from these two numbers, determine which makes less, and based off of which one makes less, that's going to give me my limiting reactant. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with 3 grams of H2. And from the periodic table, you know that there's 2.016 grams of H2 for every 1 mole of H2. Now I want to determine how many moles of NH3 I can make, and I use the mole ratio, 3 moles of H2 for every 2 moles of NH3. So 3 moles of H2, I'm going to have 2 moles of NH3. And if you do that calculation, you end up with 0.992 moles of NH3. Do the same thing for nitrogen now. So I'm going to have 10 grams of N2. And for every mole of nitrogen, it's 28.02 grams. That's from the periodic table again. My mole ratio between nitrogen and ammonia now is 1 mole of N2 gives me 2 moles of NH3. So take 10 times 2, and that's 0.714 moles of NH3. Since this one makes less, that gives me nitrogen as my limiting reactant. Okay. Now, that also tells me how much ammonia I can make. If I had to do that in grams, I could just take that and multiply it by the molar mass. So if you want to figure out how much excess I have left over, what I can do is now, because I know that this is my limiting reactant, I can determine from this number how much hydrogen I need to do this reaction. And so there's a couple ways of doing this, but one way is, because I know this is the amount I'm going to make, that's a given number now. I know from my mole ratio that for every 2 moles of NH3, I need 3 moles of H2. And then for every mole of H2, I am going to need 2.016 grams of H2. And so that gives me 2.158 grams of H2 needed. And from that number, I can take that, subtract it from 3, and that gives me 0.84 grams of H2 that's left over.